So, welcome Merve Elveren from Istanbul, a bright and young star on the curatorial scene, who was so gracious to agree to come to Sofia and tell us what she's doing. And in the meantime, to see some spaces in Sofia, meet some people as a result of her own kind of preferences, after search and research online and whatever resources are available about contemporary art in Bulgaria online. But before I give her the floor, so to say, I wanted to say a few words about the logic and the motivation behind the second part of School for Artists, Visual Dialogues, Close Encounters. There are several titles of this project of ICA Sofia. And the second part is called Back to School. In what sense is this program a back to school project? And the program actually involves invitations to curators who have important platforms nowadays, who are in the process of making a big international exhibition, be that as it may a biennial or not, or just involved in such an exhibition, or are part of an educational program, or have an institutional curatorial program in contemporary art. But mainly, the logic behind this project is very simple. You cannot expect people to be interested in what you do unless you first involve yourself and you are interested in what they do. So we want to invite here curators to learn what they're interested in, to tell us what they're doing, what their platform is. And then maybe we find something in common and they get interested in what I or you are doing. So the logic behind this project is that the curator is also a human being. A curator is not a rocket carrier, it's not a rocket booster, an engine for your career. Least of all is somebody who you have to abuse with expectations, or load with expectations as to, least of all, a curator is a person you have to instrumentalize. The logic behind this Back to School project is that it's a dialogue, you search to find common points of interest and maybe engage in a further dialogue. So having said that, I have to also say that Merve is part of Istanbul scene, which is traditionally, for us, a platform to the larger world. And this goes back to the early 90s. And then throughout these last almost 3 decades nowadays, people have been visiting Istanbul Biennial or participating in projects in Istanbul, be that as it may, group projects or individual exhibitions. A lot of people have by now visited the museums and private collections in Istanbul, or the trade fair, the contemporary, Istanbul Contemporary, the art fair, for commercial art fair for galleries. Istanbul itself has changed incredibly as an art scene compared to the early 90s. So now it's extremely, like, not only a global metropolis as a city, but it is also one of the driving forces behind the developments in contemporary art. Right now, there is the Istanbul Biennial going on there, curated by Nicolas Bourriot, one of the leading theoreticians of contemporary art, no matter whether you like or dislike his theories. And Nicolas Bourriot, just to remind you, has already been to Sofia, I think in the distant 2000, after an invitation by our colleague Desislava Dimova, and that was really 20 years ago. And then I don't know if, whoever was alive at the time, I was, but it's like what is missing in this scene is this continuity. People come here, people get interested only because you're interested in what they do. They're not to be used for career benefits. They're here because we are interested in what they do.
I want to start by just to give a bit of a background information about what I do, what I have been doing, and now what I'm doing at the moment. Between 2011 and 2018, I was a part of SALT, Research and Programs team. For those who don't know SALT is a cultural institution based in Istanbul and Ankara. It has a rather smaller office area in Ankara who organizes public programs. And it's And it usually functions and does quite a lot of exhibition programs, as well as publications, e-publications, public programs, and mainly proposes questions around contemporary art, urbanism, architecture, social and economical histories. But one of the main interests of SALT was, still is digitizing and archiving and opening up the archives. So therefore, all of the projects that you've seen so far or you will see at SALT are an outcome of a long research period. And since October 2018, I'm working as an independent curator. I'm currently working for the next iteration of Ireland's biennial, which is called EVA International, which will open in September 2020. It's in Limerick City. I would very much like to talk about EVA, but it's still an ongoing research. So I want to rather talk about some of the projects that I was involved while I was working at SALT. I will also be feeding information about what was happening at the time in Turkey, specifically in Istanbul. I do hope that you have a kind of a familiarity over the past 6 years and what happened in the city, or generally in Turkey. But please do stop me if you have any questions on the way or something is unclear. Before I start with some of the projects, I want to propose some questions and why I just selected these projects. So if you are familiar with what's happening in Turkey, there are several questions that aroused over the more than 6 years now, over the past, let's say, 10 years. And some of the questions are very much to do with how you live in the country, but also how you practice and how you continue working. In a time where political narrative is described with uncertainty, fear and despair, how do you engage with social and political reality? What are the alternative forms of engagement, new methods of engagement, and what do we call the alternative today? And if let's say the central, the authority is reinventing itself over and over again, then the alternative, which I'm using the word because I couldn't find a better word for the alternative. It's also changing. It has to change. It has to restructure itself, and this kind of creates a certain flexibility, the flexibility to maneuver, also to rethink and to be critical, and it accumulates a certain set of knowledge. Then how much of this knowledge is inherited, and how do we still do, and did we, and still do communicate this knowledge? So through the projects which I'll be showing now, I would like to talk about the similarities between then and now, and this kind of method that kept appearing in the political scene and in the art scene. So I want to start by going back to the second half of 1970s. The Scared of Murals exhibition was one of the very few first exhibition research projects that I worked on, curated by Vasif Kortun. It opened in January 2013, and it focused on the exhibitions, mural projects, press conferences, different solidarity moments organized by the Visual Artists Association. And it was, this exhibition specifically looked at a period between 1976 and 1980, exactly a day before the military coup in Turkey. The association is founded in 1975 and is not the first organization dedicated to represent the visual artist in the country. However, compared to its predecessors, the Visual Artists Association played a vital role defining the relationship between art and society, labor and market, as well as politics and censorship. That was mainly due to the personal relationship, because the members had connections with the political parties and the unions at the time. In the short history of the association, 2 organized events stand out, which also inspired the exhibition Scared of Murals. A mural festival. This is an image from the 13th Antalya Film Festival. The festival started in the 1960s, and until 1976, it was strictly about Turkish cinema, to promote the directors, promote producers, as well as actors. In 1976, however, the mayor, who was newly elected at the time, and who was an advocate of education and of society through public arts, broadened the scope of the festival by organizing a mural festival. The tradition of mural painting in Turkey is close to non-existence. The participants, the members of the association, did not have the knowledge or the tools. And that can be said for, the same can be said for the Antalya Municipality at the time, because the perception of social municipality, which is a term that started circulating in 1990s, was not known at the time. But the idea of creating monumental paintings that are easily accessible and can last longer than the festival, and the potential to interact with the inhabitants of the city created a great enthusiasm. So this is a mural done by Orhan Taylan, which was a later president of the association. He was the only one who studied in Italy mural painting, and he was very much inspired by the Latin America muralists. This is Cihat Aral's mural painting. He was one of the very first presidents of the association. The mayor's attempt of decorating the city with murals was not very successful at the end, because most of the murals were damaged and attacked by the Liberal Conservative Party supporters, and one of them was covered with fabric by the Provincial Directorate of Youth and Support. So this is Cihat Aral's mural when it was covered. This is Gülsün Kara Mustafa with her daughter, Ayşe, at the time. She was also working on a series of paintings called prison paintings after her conviction in 1971. So she couldn't get her passport until mid-80s. But I will come back to the prison paintings later on. And yeah, this is an example of the prison paintings. The collaboration between the Antalya Municipality and the Visual Artists Association is an interesting case, because until then the interaction between the local governments and the visual artists were primarily limited to interaction on municipal galleries and this kind of mutual understanding of state's agenda on arts and culture. The mural festival attempt was a meeting point to formulate an alternative approach, build on the idea of collaboration, mainly collaboration, and sharing a progressive political activism. Exactly a year later, in 1977, the association organized the May 1st exhibition, bringing together works from the members of the association, and they were kind of divided into, the exhibition was divided into sections according to different painting and sculpture studios at the Fine Arts Academy. It was announced as an annual exhibition, but the project was actually programmed to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Confederation of Revolutionary Trade Unions of Turkey. So the artists were also designing postcards for this kind of the 10th year anniversary. The opening date was, of course, not a coincidence. Early in the day, Taksim Square was filled with 500,000 demonstrators for the 1st of May celebrations. Again, holding colorful banners, mainly designed and produced by the members of the association. This is, for example, designed by Gülsün Kara Mustafa, but of course collaboratedly prepared. These three are again by her. This is Cihat Aral and Orhan Taylan while they were working on the banners with the union's members. And another image from the preparation. And this is a banner saying all art is political, but we don't know who's holding the banner. Unfortunately, the day is also known as the Taksim Square Massacre, where 30 to 40 people got killed, more than 200 people were injured, 500 of them were detained, and 90 were indicted. The exact numbers and the perpetrators are still unknown. And until 2010, the square was closed for the 1st of May celebrations. It was opened partially, and now it's closed back again. These are some images from the exhibition. It was prepared chronologically, and it was basically looking at the history of the association and the exhibitions and the different press conferences that they organized. The public program of the exhibition were even more inspiring because the talks were centered around artist associations, thinking around different solidarity methods and the different approaches between the generations and this kind of lack of communication between the association and the artist. So this is 2013. The exhibition closed on April 21st of 2013, and exactly 30 days, a month later, Gezi protests started in Taksim Square. At the park firstly, and then jumped to Taksim Square. While I was working on the Scared of Murals exhibition, I was also working on another project, which I co-curated with one of my colleagues. And it opened in the following September, so it's like 3 months after the closing of Scared of Murals. This is an image, it's an illustration, it's a magazine cover by Gülsün Kara Mustafa. And this is from 1983. And it says, what is feminism, and what is not feminism? A promised exhibition was the first comprehensive exhibition by Gülsün Kara Mustafa in Turkey and abroad, and it included her early works from 1970s until 2012, from paintings to installations, from collages to video pieces. The series that I talked about, the prison paintings, were shown for the very first time, alongside with her other painting series. This is how it was installed in the exhibition space. The recurring theme of the promised exhibition were mobility and memory. There were two themes mentioned in the press release. One was mobility, and the other one is memory. And one of the reasons was because Gülsün, as I mentioned earlier, couldn't get her passport until mid-1980s, and she mainly reflected on this kind of new visual language which took shape during the internal migration from rural Turkey to major cities. But also another reason was she was invested in the stories of displacement and border crossings. So some of the works, this kind of significant works in the exhibition is this one from 1994. This is Heimat ist, wo man ist. And another work, Double Reality, from 1987. This was a wall which had works from 1980s, but also from early 2000s. This is Mystic Transport from 1992, first shown in the 3rd Istanbul Biennial. And Memory of a Square, from 2005, one of the first videos that she worked on. At the time, so this is September 2013, before we started the research period of the exhibition in 2011, late 2011, the concept of mobility and memory had a different definition. It was not completely, and it wasn't completely different from how Gülsün reflected in her works in the 80s and in the 1990s. And it was mainly based on very familiar stories from the recent past of Turkey. But now when we go back and reread the text of the exhibition and the emphasis of the memory and the mobility, and sometimes we also say the recollection, I actually realized that the work at the time was very relevant. It happened without we knowing it. And the meaning of the words also changed quite a lot and later on. The definition of mobility and memory, in most of the cases, this lack of loss of memory, has greatly changed since 2013. And I said it was quite early at the time to understand what was really happening in the country and what about to happen. But the choice of words were also not haphazard. On the contrary, we were already working on this in this kind of escalating environments. But I want to go back to her illustration on the cover of Gösteri, this kind of arts magazine from 1983, and another work. So it was published, this magazine was specifically published in the 3 years after the military coup in 1980. And it was at the time when it was published, the country was still ruled by the Turkish armed forces. and it's reflecting on an upcoming discussion around second wave feminism. And the other work, Venus in Jar, is a work from 1987, again was in the exhibition of a promised exhibition. And the photograph of the work was later used in the poster of a festival organized by the second wave feminism in 1987, the same year. Through these two works, I would like to jump to another project. And the title is How Did We Get Here?, which opened at SALT in 2015. Of course, after 2013, it was the environment was not so easy. But 2015 in particular was a very difficult year. We had the general elections in June, and then it was cancelled. So we had another election in November 2015, the same year. And How Did We Get Here took place in between these two elections in a quite repressive and a very difficult period. How Did We Get Here was looking at a period between 1983 and 1993, a period defined as a transition to neoliberalism. And it addressed different forms of civil opposition, such as feminists, environmentalists, anti-militarists, gay rights activists, human rights defenders, and alternative education systems in the 1980s. With an emphasis on Istanbul, the exhibition used archival materials. So there were artists involved, which I will come into it, but there were a lot of newspapers, video clips, magazines, images from the Eurovision at the time, a lot from the Olympics at the time, a lot of films, long films, and it was actually, the material was collected from more than 100 people. It had these kind of moments where it showed different collaborations in the 1980s. And there were works by Halil Altındere, Esra Ersen, Ayşe Erkmen, Barış Doğrusöz, and Aslı Çavuşoğlu, and Serdar Ataşar, an archive work by Serdar Ataşar. And they were mainly, the works were chosen mainly to show the climate of the 80s and this kind of repressive climate of the 1980s. 80s is an overly discussed period in Turkey. So this is some of the images from the exhibition. It's an overly discussed period. It starts with the coup and follows by a very harsh economical change. But it was important, especially for my generation, who did not have a recollection of the 1980s, to look at it as a reminder, but also as a source of the background of the democratization period, which came later on. And it was important to understand this period, the central period, that changed the course of the history and whose actors are still active and working today. I want to show you some examples from the exhibition, not necessarily installation images, but some archival images. This is from 1981, a consciousness-raising meeting. It's inspired by the form of activism known by the same name. And people were, because it was difficult to be on the streets, women were gathering in the houses. This is before the second wave feminism started. It was the initial discussion phase. And you also see Gülsün on the right-hand side. This is a woman in black from 1989. This is a protest for the ongoing hunger strikes. And it's the woman in black is actually the name that used by the press, and it broadened the movement, this feminist movement's field of struggle. It's not a mass meeting because it was a very difficult period, but it was a very effective protest. So it's a very small but a very effective protest, and it changed the course of the second wave feminism. Olympics was again quite important at the time. Naim Süleymanoğlu represented Turkey. Yes, of course. So there was kind of this big discussion, it's a kind of a celebration to bring him to Turkey. And it was 1988, Seoul Olympics. He represented Turkey. It was like records and records for the first time ever for Turkey. So this was also included. Another was Coretta campaign from 1987. This is the first campaign, first ecological campaign, that was somehow became important for the mainstream media. So after 1987, so it was to save the Coretta in this kind of very specific beach. The Coretta logo has started being using in every ecological protest everywhere. Doesn't matter if it's about the Corettas, but it became like a very significant slogan and an image. The exhibition also showed quite a lot from the periodicals, but of the decade, but mainly from Sokak. Sokak means street. It's a weekly magazine. Only 32 issues were published in 1 year. And it looked at it was different from the other magazines at the time, because it showed it was quite political, but also it showed somewhere between a low culture and a high culture as well. The imagery that they used, the design that we used was very specific to 1980s. And it mainly looked at underrepresented at the time. So, no to compulsory military service, which was a campaign, very first campaigns of the period. It was again included in the exhibition. It says no to military campaign, compulsory military, make love, don't kill. It says there is interviews with the prostitutes, and they give their names openly. There is a section around Treaty of Lausanne and Kurdish television. And it talks about, the second one, for example, talks about how the state selected some names and claimed them they're terrorists. So, is democracy a banana? Is the title of the magazine. There's a lot about ecology as well as gender studies at the time that was quite important, but couldn't really find the right place. So Sokak was there to look at that in detail. They also had a dedicated page to rights, human rights, which was so Human Rights Association was founded in 1987, and Sokak had a very specific page. So, for example, and just to teach people the rights, what do they have? So, for example, this one is about know your rights when you're sitting at home. Transvestites know your rights. Know your rights against the press. University students know your rights. So there's always a question and an answer to how to behave in this kind of difficult circumstances. They also published, in one of the issues, they also published a game, a board. This is like a board game, but it's never like a board game. It's a page in the magazine. It's a board game, but you can't really finish it. So it's only designed for the university students who are starting the university, who are probably in depth. The education system was quite not bad, but it was suffering at the time. And it was difficult to be a student. It was difficult to be out on the street. But there was a kind of the military was never really lost its importance, and there was quite actively involved in many things. So this is a board game, it's a funny board game that will tell you that you can never finish the university. One of the other projects in the exhibition was a party. It's a political party, but it was never really started. It was an attempt. It's called the Radical Democratic Green Party. It actually started by one individual, Ibrahim Eran, who recently passed away. And it's directly linked to Italian Green Party, Federazione dei Verdi. He started there was an attempt of the political party, but it was more about gatherings in this kind of cafe that he owned. There's this newspaper, magazine, which they could only do it time to time. And the party's main target was feminists, people who associated with gay liberation at the time, anti-militarists, atheists, who were doing a lot of ecological work, and also people who are involved with the ecological work. This is from one of their campaigns about a cement factory. Of course, they were not super influential. I should mention that. It's a very small group of individuals who are interested, but it's a gay liberation page. They had a gay liberation page on their website, which is kind of new for Turkey in the 1980s, which you wouldn't really see anywhere else. There was this is from the installation photo of the exhibition. There was also a petition. The exhibition started specifically with the petition. It's actually known as the Petition of Intellectuals. And it was prepared collectively over a 4 months period. In 1984, there was a trial later on after the petition, but it was signed by more than 1,000 people. What was so interesting, it was not, although it was like Petition of Intellectuals, there was a lot of popular figures, singers, arabesque singers especially, actors, who were signing the petition. There was one work, which I will only talk about this work by Hale Tengar. So the exhibition was in 2 buildings, Salt Beyoğlu and Salt Galata. Each building, each venue had one piece that would show the atmosphere of the 1980s. Salt Beyoğlu had a film right at the entrance of the exhibition, and Salt Galata we had Hale Tengar, The Closet. This was first produced in 1997 at Art Space San Antonio, so we had to reproduce the work. And for some reason I didn't include all of the installation shots of this, but it included 3 rooms. It has 3 rooms, so you go into the space, welcomed by a living room, by 5 chairs. This is exactly the same room that Hale had at her grandmother's house. But the 5th chair is always, you see, it's at the corner, so it's a newly edition chair. There's a radio that you hear in the space. It talks about the politics of that specific time in 80s, but you also time to time hear about a football match. Then you go to a 2nd room, which unfortunately I don't have the photo, but it's a bedroom. Both of these 2 rooms are lit with a very cold light. But the 3rd room was a closet. It was more colorful compared to the 2 rooms. It was a place that, as a kid, you can get lost into. And it was also showing this kind of, although this very difficult period, politically very difficult period, and a repressive period of the 1980s, it also had this kind of cracks that you can find your way in between. One other project that was again in the exhibition was one other, let's say, a threshold in the exhibition was a Sun Ra concert in 1990, April 1990. They had a show on Istiklal Street on a truck, so it was an open air concert, and it was exactly the last day of the pedestrianization of the Istiklal Street. So by the time the cars were welcome, so you can have the cars in the street, but then next day of the Sun Ra concert, it was closed down. It was interesting to see Sun Ra on Istiklal streets. For those who know, it's still interesting to see Sun Ra. But at the time, it was an attempt it was again late 80s, early 90s, it was an attempt to normalize what was happening in the country. One of the last projects that I work on which was last year, was Aydan Murtezalu and Bülent Çangar's solo presentation called Continuity Error. Again, like Gülsün, it was their first solo presentation, but it was, Aydan and Bülent are 2, again, very prominent figures of the contemporary art in Turkey. Why it was important to do is, it was a time to look at their practices individually, and see the interaction in between. But they also started producing a lot of collaborative works later in the years, and to look at the collaborative pieces by looking at their older works from 1990s and early 2000s. One of the, again, initial points of the exhibition was to see the viewer as an interlocutor. So in every work of Aydan and Bülent, but also in the collaborative works, you would sense that as a viewer, you're always invited in somehow. So the discussion, you get to negotiate with the artist. You have to think and criticize together with the artist. These are kind of face-to-face moments, and we wanted to emphasize how this has been the case since early 1990s. And this is an image of a performative piece of their collaboration. This was first shown in Arter, and this was the second time they showed it. So they had two collaborative works at the beginning of the show and at the end of the show, and in between you will see their practices separately, but in connection to one another. As one of the last pieces, I want to talk about the Women's Library. Since 2018, spring of 2018, I'm also working with a group of women professionals for the Women's Library. This is the Women's Library and the Information Center. It's a foundation. It started in the early 1990s. And it started by the second wave feminists, which I showed the photos of. And it's the only library, or it's the only place that is left from the cultural, let's say the cultural, municipality's cultural agenda from the late 80s, early 90s. So during 87 to 1994, there's this kind of opening to re-function some of the buildings in Istanbul as exhibition venues for museums. That's why if you go and check the 1992 biennial catalog, it says Eczacıbaşı Contemporary Art Museum, which never really happened later on because of the change in the municipality. But this is the only place that survives because they managed to find the building, started in the early 1990s, and it's still active today. It's the only women library in Turkey dedicated to archives of women. They get donations, so if you go there, you can donate your own archive, but you can also use this kind of periodicals. They have this extensive archive from late Ottoman to now, with translations, all of the feminist movement, like the women's movement, and all of the things that was produced between this period. And we have been working with them just as outside collaborators, let's say. We organize events to fundraise for the library, because the library is a part of the municipality. I want to stop here. If you have any questions, we can discuss more. But maybe it's just important to say that as artists, curators, researchers working and practicing in this kind of harsh and interesting circumstances, these projects, none of them try to offer an answer. They are not offering a way out, but these are kind of new proposals as reminders of what was inherited and what are the similarities between then and now. If you're a bit familiar of what happened in Turkey in terms of what was used, the magazines or how we use the Taksim Square now, they try to get a kind of a rhythm in between. And what was important at the time to do these exhibitions without really knowing what was happening, but it was just to be relevant, not to represent what was happening daily on the streets, of course, not to reflect it daily, but to keep an open conversation with the political circumstances, the social circumstances, and what the institution was doing at the time. I think it's still an open question of how this knowledge that was produced in the 1970s and 1980s and later in the 1990s through Aydan and Bülent, how this knowledge can be transferred, how this knowledge can be reused, and can be not just locally, but also internationally. Because I'm also quite sure, although this is very much about the recent history of Turkey, there's quite a lot of similarities in terms of methodology, what was used. There's a shared history, and it resonates especially when you look at the 1980s and 1990s. There is a shared history there in terms of the alternative, how you describe the alternative. Okay, I'm going to stop here.